The Midsummer Fete at Maromere Hall was not a celebration. It was a performance of polished marble and practiced smiles. The air hung heavy with the scent of cut grass and the cloying perfume of aristocrats who had never known the sting of a day's labor. Win Vane, the Duchess of Maromere, stood under the silk canopy, her spine as rigid as the steel bones of her corset. Her sky-blue silk gown, chosen by the Dowager Queen Theodora, was a masterpiece of restraint, high-collared, long-sleeved, and suffocatingly heavy. It was a garment designed to suppress, to hide the woman who had once been Winthorn, the ferryman's daughter who knew how to read the mood of a river by the color of its silt. Win felt the familiar prickle of heat beneath her collar. She kept her chin level, her hands folded over the faded river glass hidden deep within her glove, her only anchor to the girl she had been before the crown, before the grief, before the lie. "My governess was very particular, Your Grace," Win replied, her voice smooth, the vowels sanded down by years of patient, agonizing correction. Across the lawn, Crown Prince Alaric Vane stood by the terrace, his gaze fixed on the horizon, pointedly avoiding the stretch of the river where the reeds shivered in the strengthening wind. He was the picture of regal authority, yet Win saw the tremor in his fingers as they hovered near his stopped pocket watch. He was a man who had folded his grief away years ago, believing that composure was the only barrier between him and the chaos of the world. The sky suddenly bruised to a deep, sickly purple. The smell of churned mud rose, overriding the roses. Autumn floods in Maromere arrived without an invitation, a sudden violent reclamation of the banks. A sharp, high-pitched scream cut through the polite murmur of the string quartet. "Lynette!" a woman cried out from the fringes of the Fete. On the riverbank, the 11-year-old girl, Lynette Crane, had slipped on the mud-slick stones. The swollen current, angry and brown, had snatched her instantly. She was already 20 feet out, her small arms thrashing against the force of the water. The court froze. It was a tableau of paralyzed indecision. The nobles took half steps forward, then stopped, their silk shoes clinging to the pristine lawn, their minds calculating the cost of ruined velvet against the value of a commoner's life. Win moved before the sound of the girl's splash had even fully died away. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the dowager. She looked only at the water, the dark, familiar, dangerous force she had loved and feared since she was 12. "Win, stop!" Alaric was there, his hand gripping her arm, his face contorted in a mask of genuine panic. Or perhaps it was just the sheer, terrifying threat to his composure. "You are a duchess, not a fisherman's daughter," he shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of fury and fear. Win froze. His words landed like a physical blow, a reminder of the prison she had lived in for 3 years. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man who would rather let a child drown than step off his pedestal of royal decorum. She pulled her arm free, her eyes flashing with a sudden, searing clarity. "Then I am no use to anyone," she whispered, a chilling echo of her father's voice. She kicked off her heavy silk slippers, the fabric tearing as she did. She didn't hesitate, she didn't calculate, she dove. The impact of the cold, churning water was a revelation. It didn't fight her. She knew how to read its rhythm, how to let it carry her sideways, how to stroke through the current rather than battle it head-on. The court behind her erupted into a chaos of shouting voices, but to Win, the world had narrowed down to the small, shivering figure in the water. She was 12 years old again, watching her brother Toby slip away. But this time, the story would not end in silence. This time, she would hold on. She reached the girl just as the current took a violent turn around the bend. Her fingers closed around it. He rough wool of Lynette's shift. As she kicked back toward the shallows, the force of the flood pushed her hard against the steep, crumbling bank. Her foot caught on something rigid, not stone, not a root, but a heavy, rectangular object embedded in the mud of the bank, exposed by the surging river. It was a small, lead-lined wooden box, half buried and forgotten by time. She shouldn't have stopped. Every instinct of survival shouted at her to keep swimming. But as she dragged the girl toward the bank, her hand slipped beneath the box, and she felt the heavy, wax-sealed weight of something that didn't belong to the river. With a grunt of effort, she hauled both the girl and the box onto the sodden, muddy grass of the palace lawn. The silence that followed was absolute. Wynne lay there, gasping, her sky-blue gown shredded and heavy with river silt, her hair coming undone in wild, dark strands. She looked up. 200 guests were staring. The Dowager Queen Theodora stood in the center, her face the color of cold ash, her ruby ring clutched so tightly in her palm she had nearly drawn blood. And Alaric. Alaric stood at the edge of the lawn, his velvet coat ruined by the spray, his face drained of all color, staring not at the rescued girl, but at the muddy box Wynne had dragged from the grave of the riverbank. The lie, 18 years in the making, had finally started to sink. Wynne's lungs burned with a terrifying, familiar fire. The mud beneath her knees was a freezing, solid reality against the chaotic, deafening roar of the flooded river. Lynette coughed, a violent, rattling sound that meant life. Wynne pulled the 11-year-old girl into her chest, wrapping her trembling arms around the shivering, fragile shoulders. River water streamed from Wynne's hair, washing away the powder, the heavy silver pins, the perfectly constructed illusion of the Duchess of Maromere. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. Alaric stood a few paces away. He looked down at her as if she were a stranger who had just committed an act of treason on his pristine lawn. He was the crown prince, the regent of the realm. Yet in that moment, he looked like a terrified boy. "Wynne," he breathed, the word stripped of its usual measured royal cadence. His storm-gray eyes darted from the muddy, gasping child to the ruined, soaking wet sky-blue silk of his wife's gown. He had screamed that a duchess does not swim. She had just proved that a true duchess does not stand on the bank and watch a child die. But it was Theodora who moved first. The Dowager Queen pushed past her paralyzed son, ignoring the mud that instantly stained the hem of her immaculate black silk gown. Her pale, cold eyes were not on the coughing child. They were locked with a sudden, naked terror onto the small, lead-lined wooden box resting against Wynne's hip. "Give that to me," Theodora commanded. Her voice was not a polite request. It was the sharp, panicked crack of a whip. Wynne looked down at the heavy box. It was encrusted with river silt, its iron hinges rusted from years of submersion. She had felt it buried deep in the crumbling bank when the current slammed her against the roots, dislodged from its grave by the violent autumn surge. "The child needs a physician," Wynne said, her voice gravelly and raw from swallowing river water. She kept one arm protectively over Lynette. "Leave the rubbish and see to the girl if you must," Theodora snapped, stepping closer, her hand outstretched with an entitlement that made Wynne's blood run cold. The Dowager's ruby ring glinted menacingly in the bruised, purple light of the storm. A lady of the crown does not scavenge in the mud like a peasant. Wynne's fingers tightened around the heavy, waterlogged wood of the box. For 3 years she had bowed her head to this severe woman. For 3 years she had apologized for her existence, burying the Ferryman's daughter to keep the polished duchess alive, terrified her low-born accent or habits would slip. But the river had washed the fear out of her bones. The current had reminded her of who she truly was. "No." The word fell into the space between them, heavy and absolute. Theodora flinched as if physically struck. The court behind them gasped in collective shock. "What did you say to me?" "I said no." Wynne rose slowly to her feet. Her sky-blue gown, once a masterpiece of restrictive elegance, was now ruined, clinging heavily to her legs, stained dark brown with silt. Yet standing there dripping river water onto the manicured grass, her spine straight as a blade, she radiated more raw, commanding authority than she ever had while wearing a corset. She picked up the box, tucking it firmly under her arm, and reached down to help the shivering Lynette up. "I am going inside. If the court wishes to stand in the rain and debate my manners, they are welcome to it." She did not look at Alaric as she walked past him. She didn't need to. The silence of the 200 nobles was loud enough. She had broken the ultimate rule of Maromere Hall. She had shown the court that the river was not something to be feared, but something to be conquered. The entrance to the palace was a cavern of white marble and gilded mirrors, designed to intimidate and awe. Wynne's bare, bleeding feet left dark, muddy footprints across the pristine floor. Each step was a quiet rebellion. The servants, usually invisible and silent, paused in the corridors, staring in disbelief. Mrs. Quill, the stoic housekeeper, appeared immediately, her composed face cracking with genuine shock at the sight of her mistress soaked, trembling, and bleeding from a scrape on her knee. "Your Grace," Mrs. Quill gasped, immediately signaling the footman for thick wool blankets. "The physician. Send for Dr. Aldous," Wynne ordered, her tone brokering no argument, leaning Linnet's weight against her own. "And bring hot water, dry linens, and broth to the east guest room. Let no one else inside, not even the prince." "Wynne," Alaric's voice echoed down the marble hall. He had followed them inside, leaving his mother and the bewildered guests on the lawn. He stood at the edge of the foyer, his polished leather boots refusing to step into the trail of river mud. His jaw was locked tight, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What have you done?" "I saved a life," Wynne said simply, turning to face him, the water still dripping from her chin onto the marble. "You should try it sometime, Alaric. It is remarkably clarifying." She turned her back on the Crown Prince of Maromere and carried the girl up the grand sweeping staircase, leaving him standing alone with the echoes of her defiance. The east guest room was soon warm, a heavy fire roaring in the hearth to chase away the damp. Linnet sat swathed in thick blankets, her thin face pale, her lips slowly losing their terrifying blue tint. She drank the hot broth Mrs. Quill had brought with a desperate, unself-conscious hunger. Wynne sat in a high-backed chair beside the bed, still wearing her ruined wet silk. Mrs. Quill had begged her to change, but Wynne had refused. The physical cold seeping into her skin was a necessary anchor. It kept her fury sharp. She placed the muddy, lead-lined box on the mahogany table beside her, her eyes tracing the rusted iron latch. Linnet lowered the empty bowl. Her sharp eyes, old beyond their 11 years, studied Wynne carefully. "You talk like gentry," the girl said, her voice a raspy whisper that cut through the crackle of the fire. "But you swim like Hollow Reach, like river folk. Which one's the lie?" Wynne's breath caught against her ribs. She looked at the girl's small, fierce face. There was no judgment there, only the raw, undeniable recognition of one survivor seeing another through a carefully constructed disguise. "My father was a ferryman," Wynne said quietly, the truth leaving her lips for the first time in an entire decade, feeling strangely like an exhale she had been holding for years. "He taught me how to read the current. He taught me not to fight it." Lynette nodded slowly, hugging her knees to her chest. "My dad used to say the same thing, right before the river took him." "What is your name, sweetheart?" Wynne asked, leaning forward, the cold silk rustling heavily against the chair. Lynette Crane. My dad was Silas Crane. He worked the barges on the S before he died 3 winters back." The name sent a physical shock through Wynne's chest, sharp enough to stop her heart. Silas Crane. She had heard the hushed whispers in the palace servants' hall. 18 years ago, the old king, Alaric's father, had drowned in this exact river. The official story, the narrative Theodora guarded with lethal, suffocating precision, was that the king had slipped on the muddy bank during a storm. It was deemed a tragic, foolish accident, and Silas Crane, a lowly bargeman who had been nearby, had supposedly stood frozen in cowardice, failing to save the monarch. The Crane family had been ruined, exiled from steady work, forced to carry the blame of a kingdom to protect the crown's flawless image. "He never talked about that day much," Lynette whispered, staring blindly into the roaring fire. "But he told me once, when he was deep in his cups and weeping. He said the crown took a brave man and turned him into a fool, and they took a poor man and turned him into a villain. Also, the royals wouldn't have to admit they bleed just like us. Wynne felt the blood drain completely from her face. She turned her gaze to the mud-encrusted box on the table. The river always gives back what it takes, her father used to say. Eventually. She waited until Lynette fell into a heavy, exhausted sleep. The storm outside had broken fully, rain lashing violently against the tall windows, obscuring the kingdom in a sheet of gray. Wynne moved to the table. The box was sealed with heavy lead, designed to survive the damp, but the violent current and a century of water had fractured the iron latch. Wynne took the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth, slipped it under the lock, and pressed down with all the strength in her shoulders. The lock snapped with a sharp, echoing crack. Wynne pushed the lid open. The smell of stagnant water and old, decaying leather filled the air. Inside lay a thick, leather-bound journal. The edges of the pages were severely water-stained, warped into brittle waves, but the center of the book remained miraculously preserved. On the cover, pressed in faded gold leaf, was the royal crest of House Vane. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. It was not from the cold, but from the terrifying weight of what she was holding. She opened the heavy cover. The handwriting was elegant, slanted, and unmistakably masculine. It was the old king's private journal. She turned the damp pages carefully, holding her breath, until she reached the final, smeared entry. The date was exactly 18 years ago, the exact day the king had died. The ink was blurred at the edges, but the words were a devastatingly clear command, written with a steady hand. The river is rising fast. The crane boy has fallen near the mill race. The royal guard tells me to stay back, that it is beneath my station to risk the crown of Maromere for a commoner's son. But what is a crown that watches its people die from the safety of the shore? I leave Alaric to the care of the council. Let him know that true nobility is not in the blood, but in the action. I go into the water. Below it, barely legible but undeniably real, was a hastily stamped royal seal in deep crimson wax. It was not just a journal entry. It was a final decree, a testament of a king who chose to be a hero. Wynne stared at the parchment. Her tears, held back tightly for years, finally broke, falling silently and mixing with the river water still dripping from her chin. Theodora hadn't just buried a journal to protect her pride. She had buried her own husband's supreme act of courage. She had let her son, Alaric, grow up believing his father died a clumsy, embarrassing death, leaving the crown prince traumatized, rigidly obsessed with composure, and terrified of his own humanity. And she had let an innocent man, Silas Crane, carry the devastating blame of an entire kingdom, starving his family into the dirt to ensure the illusion of royal perfection remained intact. The heavy oak door to the guest room suddenly clicked open. Wynne spun around, instinctively slipping the open journal behind the folds of her ruined silk skirt. Dowager Queen Theodora stood in the doorway. The dim hallway light cast long, skeletal shadows across her severe, narrow face. Her pale blue eyes swept over the sleeping child dismissively, and then settled with venomous precision on the broken lead box resting on the table. "You have pulled a dangerous thread, little fairy girl," Theodora said, her voice dropping the elegant pretense of politeness, revealing the cold, dynastic cruelty underneath. She stepped into the room, tapping her ruby ring against the doorframe. "And you have absolutely no idea how quickly it will unravel your entire world." The air in the East guest room seemed to freeze the moment Dowager Queen Theodora crossed the threshold. She moved with the predatory grace of a woman who had spent decades turning the royal court into a battlefield, her black silk gown whispering ominously over the floorboards. Wynne stood her ground, the heavy water-stained journal pressed firmly behind her back, hidden within the damp, ruined folds of her sky-blue skirt. The physical weight of the truth burned against her cold fingers. "You think you have won a victory today," Theodora said, her voice a soft, venomous purr as she looked at the broken iron lock on the muddy box. You think dragging a filthy commoner from the river makes you a savior. It merely makes you a spectacle. You have shamed House Vane in front of the entire kingdom. I saved a child, Wynne replied, her chin tilted upward, her hazel eyes locking onto Theodora's pale, calculating stare. A child whose family was destroyed by this house. Theodora's gaze sharpened, dropping to the empty lead box, then back to Wynne's face. She noted the way Wynne's arm was held rigidly behind her back. The Dowager's ruby ring ceased its tapping. Give me what you took from that box, Wynthorne. Do not play games of state that you do not understand. Wynne felt her corset digging painfully into her ribs, a phantom restriction she had lived with for 3 years. But she was no longer the frightened girl desperately trying to memorize the correct fork to use at a state banquet. She was a woman who had just fought a flooded river and won. Or what? Wynne asked, the syllables clipped and cold. You will tell the court I am a ferryman's daughter? You will strip me of the title you so generously allowed me to wear? Tell them. Let them. No, the regent married a peasant, but when you do, I will tell them exactly what the peasant found at the bottom of the river. For the first time in 18 years, Dowager Queen Theodora looked genuinely uncertain. The mask of perfect aristocratic boredom slipped, revealing the terrifying desperation of a ruler whose foundation was cracking. You are a fool, Theodora spat, taking a step closer, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think a piece of rotting parchment matters? I am the Queen Mother. I built the stability of this kingdom out of the ashes of my husband's foolishness. I protected the crown. I protected my son. You protected your pride, Wynne shot back, her voice shaking with a quiet, terrible fury. You let Alaric believe his father was a coward who died a pointless death. You let Silas Crane carry the blame until it broke him. You didn't save the crown, Theodora. You poisoned it. Theodora's face paled to the color of bone. She drew herself up to her full, towering height. Guards, she snapped. 2 royal guardsmen in silver and black uniforms stepped into the doorway, their hands resting uneasily on the hilts of their swords. They looked between the furious dowager and the soaked, muddy duchess. Confine the duchess to her quarters, Theodora ordered, her tone absolute. She is suffering from hysteria brought on by the cold water, and remove the street urchin from my palace. The guards hesitated, taking half a step into the room. Wynne did not flinch. She stepped forward, placing her body entirely between the guards and the sleeping linnet. The muddy water from her ruined dress pooled on the fine Persian rug. She channeled every ounce of royal authority she had observed, mimicking the absolute stillness of a true monarch. I am the Duchess of Maromere, Wynne said, her voice cutting through the room with the sharp, clear ring of struck steel. I am the wife of the Crown Prince Regent. The first man who lays a hand on me or the child under my protection will hang for treason before the sun sets. The guards froze. They knew the law of the crown. The dowager commanded respect, but Wynne wore the regent's ring. The hierarchy was clear, even if it had never been tested. They lowered their heads and took a slow step backward into the hall. Theodora's jaw locked. She looked at Wynne with a hatred so pure it practically hummed in the air. You have sealed your own ruin, the dowager whispered. By midnight, the royal council will declare you unfit. Enjoy your crown for the next few hours, fairy girl. It is the last time you will ever wear it. Theodora turned and swept out of the room, the guards following quickly in her wake. Wynne exhaled a shaky breath, the adrenaline slowly leaving her veins, replaced by the bone-deep chill of her wet clothes. She turned to Mrs. Quill, who had been standing silently in the corner, her hands clamped over her mouth in shock. Lock the door from the inside, Wynne instructed, pulling the waterlogged journal from behind her back. Do not open it for anyone except me, not the guards, not the dowager. Your Grace, Mrs. Quill whispered, her eyes wide with fear. What are you going to do? I am going to find my husband, Wynne said, and I am going to break his heart. The corridors of Maromere Hall were unnervingly quiet. The guests had been ushered away, the fete officially canceled due to the storm. Outside, the thunder rolled like artillery fire, and the rain lashed violently against the tall, stained-glass windows. Wynne walked through the shadows of the palace, leaving a trail of river mud and water on the polished marble. The heavy, soaked silk of her blue gown dragged behind her like a prisoner's chain, but she refused to stop and change. She needed Alaric to see the mud. She needed him to smell the river. She needed him to confront the messy, uncontrollable reality he had spent his entire life avoiding. She found him in the palace library. The room was vast, lined with towering shelves of leather-bound histories and royal decrees. A single fire burned in the massive hearth, casting long, flickering shadows across the room. Alaric sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, a glass of untouched brandy in front of him. In his hands he held his signature silver pocket watch, his thumb tracing the hands that had been frozen for 18 years. He looked up as the heavy oak doors opened. When he saw her, still soaked, her hair plastered to her neck, her gown ruined, his face hardened into the familiar, rigid mask of the crown prince. "You should be in your chambers, changing out of those rags," Alaric said, his voice flat, devoid of the panic he had shown on the lawn. He was rebuilding his walls, brick by careful brick. "The entire court is whispering about the spectacle you made. My mother is currently pacifying the Duke of Somerset because my wife decided to act like a fisherman's daughter," Wynne finished for him, her voice startlingly calm as she walked toward the desk. Alaric's jaw tightened. "Like a woman who does not understand the weight of the crown she wears. You embarrassed us, Wynne. Dukes and duchesses do not throw themselves into floodwaters like common laborers. We send the guards. We maintain order." "The guards were paralyzed, Alaric," Wynne said, stopping directly in front of his desk. "If I had waited for order, that child would be dead, just like your father." The silence that followed was absolute. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo like a hammer striking an anvil. Alaric stood up slowly, his storm-gray eyes flashing with a dangerous, volatile light. "Do not speak of my father. You know nothing of that day." "I know that you stood on the bank and watched him drown," Wynne said, the words slipping out like a blade. It was cruel, but she needed to pierce the armor. "I know that you were 14 years old, and you did not move because you were taught that a prince does not compromise his dignity." Alaric's hand slammed down on the desk. "I was a child. I was told to stay back. I obeyed the law of the crown." "The law of the crown is a lie," Wynne shouted back, the polite, sanded-down Duchess vanishing completely, replaced by the raw, bleeding grief of the girl from Hollow Reach. "You have spent 18 years hating yourself for being a coward, wrapping yourself in velvet and rules because you are terrified of the water. But you weren't a coward, Alaric. You were just lied to." She reached into the folds of her wet skirt and pulled out the heavy, water-stained journal. With a loud, wet smack, she dropped it directly onto the polished mahogany desk, right next to his frozen pocket watch. Alaric stared at the rotting leather, his brow furrowing in confusion. "What is this trash?" "It is the truth," Wynne said, her voice dropping to a ragged whisper. "I found it buried in the bank where the river tore away the earth. It is your father's private journal. The final entry was written on the day he died." Alaric recoiled as if the book were a venomous snake. He took a step back from the desk, his hands rising defensively. "No, that is impossible. My mother secured all of his papers." "She buried this one," Wynne said, stepping around the desk to stand beside him. "Because this one didn't fit her narrative. Read it, Alaric." "I will not look at a river-soaked forgery," Alaric said, his voice trembling, his eyes locked desperately on the floor. "Read it," Wynne commanded, not as his wife, but as a queen. She grabbed the heavy cover and flipped it open to the final smeared page. The deep crimson wax of the royal seal sat heavily at the bottom of the page, unmistakable and absolute. Alaric's eyes were drawn to the seal. He recognized the heavy crest of House Vane, Slowly, against his own will, his gaze drifted up to the slanted, elegant handwriting he had spent his childhood trying to mimic. Wynne watched his face as he read the words. She watched 18 years of carefully constructed reality shatter in real time. I leave Alaric to the care of the council. Let him know that true nobility is not in the blood, but in the action. I go into the water. Alaric stopped breathing. The color drained from his face, leaving him as pale as the marble statues in the hallway. His hand reached out, hovering over the water-stained ink, but he did not touch it. His fingers were trembling violently. "He didn't slip," Alaric whispered, the sound tearing out of his throat like a sob. "He went in on purpose, to save the Crane boy." "Yes," Wynne said softly, her anger fading into a deep, profound sorrow for the man she loved. "And my mother knew," Alaric said, looking up at Wynne, his storm-gray eyes wide with a horrified realization. "She knew he was a hero, and she let the kingdom call him a fool. She let me believe I was the son of a fool. She ruined the Crane family to hide it. She did it to protect the illusion of royal perfection," Wynne said. "And she is convening the Royal Council right now to strip me of my title, lock me away for madness, and destroy this journal forever." Alaric looked back down at the desk. He touched the frozen pocket watch, then looked at the crimson royal seal on the ruined parchment. The battle behind his eyes was visceral, the terrified, obedient prince fighting against the furious, betrayed son. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the library burst open. Lord Minister Thorne, flanked by 4 armed members of the Royal Guard, strode into the room. In his hand, he held a freshly stamped warrant bearing the Dowager's black wax seal. "Forgive the intrusion, Your Highness," the Lord Minister said, his voice dripping with oily, false regret. He did not look at Alaric. His cold eyes were fixed entirely on Wynne. "But the Dowager Queen and the Royal Council have reached a unanimous decision. The Duchess is to be taken to the Tower for evaluation. Her mind has been fractured by the river." Wynne did not step back. She stood beside Alaric, her ruined silk dripping onto the floor, waiting to see if the Crown Prince would finally find the courage to swim. The 4 armed members of the Royal Guard spread out across the library, their boots heavy on the polished oak floorboards. Lord Minister Thorne stood at their center, his sallow face fixed in an expression of oily, practiced sorrow. He held the warrant out, the black wax of the Dowager's seal stark against the cry. "White parchment. Step away from the Duchess, Your Highness," Thorne said, his voice smooth, betraying no panic despite the tension thick enough to choke on. "The physician has already signed the affidavit. The cold water has clearly fractured her mind. It is a tragedy, but we must protect the crown from her delusions." Alaric remained frozen behind his desk. His hands were braced against the mahogany, his knuckles white, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the empty space where the journal had been just a second before. He was trapped between 2 worlds, the safe, sterile lie his mother had built for him, and the terrifying, muddy truth his wife had just dragged from the river. Wynne did not wait for her husband to find his voice. She snatched the water-stained journal from the desk, clutching the rotting leather to her chest. The cold dampness of the book seeped through the ruined bodice of her blue silk gown, anchoring her to the reality of what she fought for. "Touch me, Lord Thorne," Wynne warned, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that echoed the rumble of the flooded river outside. "And you will spend the rest of your short life regretting it." Thorne offered a patronizing, pitying smile. "Restrain her, gently if you can, but do not let her destroy any more of His Highness's study." 2 guards stepped forward, their hands reaching out. "Stop." The word did not come from Alaric, it came from the doorway. Dowager Queen Theodora stepped into the library, her black silk gown sweeping over the threshold like a shadow stretching across the room. She looked at the guards, at Thorne, and finally at Wynne. There was no pretense of grandmotherly concern now. The aristocratic mask had completely fallen, revealing the ruthless architect of a kingdom's deception. "You have made a terrible miscalculation, Wynne Thorne," Theodora said, deliberately using Wynne's maiden name. the name of the ferryman's daughter. She walked toward the desk, her pale blue eyes fixed on the journal in Wynn's arms. You thought bringing a piece of rotting trash into my palace would make you a hero. You thought you could rewrite history. But history is not written by girls who smell of fish and river mud. It is written by the people who hold the power to burn the pages. This is your husband's handwriting, Wynn said, refusing to step back, her spine stiffening despite the bone-deep chill shivering through her muscles. This is his final command, his royal seal. You buried it to protect your pride. I buried it to protect the throne, Theodora snapped, her voice finally losing its icy control, cracking like a whip against the stone walls. She turned to Alaric, who was still staring at her in silent, paralyzed horror. Your father was a fool, Alaric, a weak, sentimental fool. Kings do not throw themselves into raging rivers for the sake of a bargeman's spawn. Kings are monuments. They are untouchable. If the court had known he died thrashing in the mud like a commoner, they would have seen House Vane as weak. The nobles would have torn us apart. I made him a tragic accident to save your inheritance. You let Silas Crane take the blame, Alaric whispered, his voice sounding hollow, as if coming from a great distance. You let the village hate him. You let him starve. It was a necessary sacrifice, Theodora dismissed coldly, not even looking at her son, her attention entirely fixed on Wynn. And I will make another one today to maintain that order. Lord Thorne, take the forgery from the Duchess. It is not a forgery, Wynn said, her fingers tightening around the journal. The corset beneath her dress felt as though it were shrinking, crushing her ribs, making it hard to draw a breath. It was the phantom weight of the palace, the suffocating pressure of a court that demanded silence above all else. But she thought of Toby's hand slipping from hers 13 years ago. She thought of Lynette's terrified eyes in the water. No, never again. It is the truth, and I will read it to the entire court myself. Theodora laughed, a dry, humorless sound. You will not speak to the court, little bird. You will be locked in the West Tower, screaming at the walls, mourning the tragic loss of your sanity. And as for the street urchin you pulled from the river, the Dowager checked the gold clock on the mantel. By now, the guards have already dragged her out the servants' gate. A carriage is taking her to the northern workhouses. She will disappear into the soot and the looms, just as her father disappeared into the river. The air left Wynn's lungs. A visceral jolt of pure terror spiked through her chest. Lynette, the girl who had looked at her and recognized a sister of the river, the child she had promised to protect. You touch one hair on that child's head, Wynn hissed, taking a sudden aggressive step toward the Dowager, the polite Duchess completely dead, replaced by a feral, unyielding protector. And I will tear this palace down stone by stone. One of the royal guards panicked at the sudden movement. He lunged forward, grabbing Wynn's arm roughly, twisting her wrist to force her to drop the journal. The physical jolt of a man's heavy hand on her arm triggered a violent flash of memory. Her father, Garrick Thorne, his large, calloused hands shaking as he held the ferry pole, his eyes hollowed out by grief. The memory did not make her weak, it made her furious. Wynn did not scream. She did not flinch. She twisted her body with the leverage of a woman who had spent her youth hauling heavy ropes against the current. She drove her elbow sharply into the guard's ribs, breaking his grip instantly, and stepped back, clutching the journal safely to her chest, her hazel eyes blazing with aristocratic fury. I am the Duchess of Maromere! Wynn roared, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, silencing the rain outside. And you will not lay hands on me! The guard drew his sword, the metallic shing ringing out in the quiet library. Thorne took a step back, gesturing for the other 3 guards to surround her. Wynn stood alone in the center of the room, her blue silk ruined, her bare feet bleeding on the oak, holding a dead king's truth against a room full of people ready to kill for a lie. She looked at Alaric. He was still standing behind the desk. Are you going to watch? Wynn asked him, her voice suddenly dropping, quiet and devastating. "Are you going to stand on the bank again, Alaric? Are you going to let them drown me too?" Alaric looked at the drawn sword pointed at his wife. He looked at the mud on her dress. He looked at his mother, whose face was twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate preservation. For 18 years, Alaric had lived in a cage made of rules. He had believed that dignity meant standing perfectly still while the world broke apart around him. He had believed that safety was found in silence. But looking at Wynne, wounded, dripping, magnificent in her absolute refusal to bend, he realized the truth. Composure was not courage. Composure was a corpse. Alaric's hand moved. He did not reach for his royal seal. He did not reach for the bell to call more guards. He reached for his silver pocket watch, the one that had been stopped for 18 years. With a sudden, violent motion, he hurled the silver watch across the room. It smashed against the stone hearth, shattering the glass and sending the broken gears scattering across the floor. The sharp sound made everyone in the room freeze. "Sheathe your weapon," Alaric said. The voice did not belong to a traumatized prince. It belonged to a king. It was heavy, dark, and absolute. The guard with the drawn sword hesitated, looking toward Theodora. Alaric stepped out from behind the heavy mahogany desk. He moved with a sudden, terrifying grace, crossing the floor until he stood directly in front of the guard. He did not shout. He did not raise his hands. He simply looked the man in the eyes. "If that blade is not in its scabbard in 1 second," Alaric said, his tone chillingly flat, "I will have you hanged from the palace gates by your own belt. Sheathe it." The guard swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. He quickly slammed the sword back into its scabbard and took 3 rapid steps backward. "Alaric, what are you doing?" Theodora demanded, stepping forward, her composure finally beginning to fray. "She is a danger to the crown. She is my wife," Alaric interrupted, his voice cutting through his mother's panic like a blade through silk. He turned to Wynne. He looked at her bruised arm, at the mud on her skin, at the trembling, water-stained journal clutched to her chest. He gently placed his hands over hers. His fingers were warm against her freezing skin. "May I?" he asked softly. Wynne searched his storm-gray eyes. She saw the terror there, the decades of conditioned fear. But beneath it, she saw the foundation of the man she had loved in the quiet hours of their marriage. The man who was finally choosing to wake up. Slowly, she relaxed her grip, letting him take the heavy, damp journal. Alaric held his father's final words. He did not look at them. He held them against his chest, claiming the truth as his own. He turned to Lord Minister Thorne. "Minister, if the child Lynette Crane is not returned to the East Guest Room completely unharmed, within the next 5 minutes you will be stripped of your titles, your lands, and your head." Thorne opened his mouth to argue, saw the lethal, unblinking promise in the Regent's eyes, and quickly bowed. "At once, Your Highness." He scurried out of the library, shouting orders to the guards in the hallway. Theodora was trembling now. The absolute authority she had wielded for 2 decades was evaporating before her eyes. "You are making a mistake," she whispered, her voice tight. "The nobles will not accept this. They will not accept her. A commoner who swims in the mud. A king who died like a fool. You are throwing away the dignity of House Vane." "Dignity is a lie we tell ourselves to excuse our cowardice, Mother," Alaric said, his voice ringing with a tragic, profound clarity. "My father died a hero. My wife fought a flood to save a child you ordered discarded. They are the only true royalty this house has seen in a century, and I am done pretending otherwise." Alaric turned his back on the Dowager Queen. He looked at Wynne, extending his arm to her, not as a prince offering an escort, but as an equal offering a partnership. "Where are we going?" Wynne asked, her voice shaking slightly as the adrenaline finally began to recede. "To the marble throne hall," Alaric said, his eyes hard and resolute. "We are going to call the court." and we are going to show them exactly what a true queen looks like. The marble throne hall of Maromere was a cavern of ancient power, illuminated by hundreds of beeswax candles set in massive iron chandeliers. The cold marble floor reflected the flickering light, offering a mirror to the kingdom's most elite nobles, who had been hastily summoned from their guest quarters. The air hummed with venomous, excited whispers. The fete had been a disaster. The Duchess had lost her mind to the river, and the Dowager Queen was about to restore order. That was the narrative circulating through the velvet-clad ranks. Dowager Queen Theodora stood on the dais, one step below the empty throne. Her black silk gown absorbed the light, a stark contrast to the pale, powdered skin of her severe face. Her ruby ring tapped rhythmically against the gilded armrest of the regent's chair. She was ready. The physician's affidavit was in her pocket. The guards were stationed at the doors. The ferry girl was going to be raised. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall swung open with a resounding, echoing crash. The whispers died instantly. 200 nobles turned, expecting to see guards dragging a hysterical, broken woman. Instead, the court stopped breathing entirely. Crown Prince Alaric walked through the doors. He did not wear his ceremonial sword, and his dark velvet coat was ruined, stained with river spray and rain. But it was his posture that shocked the room. For 3 years, the court had known a cautious, rigidly polite regent who managed the kingdom through quiet ledgers. The man walking down the center aisle now was a war king in all but name, his storm-gray eyes burning with a dark, absolute authority that dared anyone to speak. And walking beside him, her hand resting firmly in his, was Wynne. She had not changed. She still wore the shredded, heavy sky-blue silk gown, its hem soaked in dark river mud that dragged across the pristine white marble. Her feet were bare, scraped, and bleeding slightly from the stones of the bank. Her dark hair hung in damp, wild waves over her shoulders. She looked like a woman who had been dragged through hell, yet her spine was impossibly straight, her chin angled with an unbreakable sauver. Vain pride. She did not look like a duchess apologizing for a breach of etiquette. She looked like a queen who had come to collect a debt. The silence in the hall was deafening. The only sound was the heavy, wet drag of Wynne's silk skirt and the soft slap of her bare feet against the cold stone. Theodora's hands gripped the armrest. Her pale eyes widened as she saw what Alaric carried in his free hand, a rotting, water-stained leather journal. Alaric led Wynne to the base of the dais. He did not ascend the steps to the throne. Instead, he turned to face the sea of aristocrats, standing shoulder to shoulder with his mud-stained wife. 18 years ago, Alaric began, his voice carrying effortlessly to the vaulted ceiling, deep and resonant. This kingdom was told a story. We were told that my father, the king, slipped on a muddy bank and drowned in a tragic, foolish accident. We were told that a bargeman named Silas Crane stood by in cowardice and let his monarch die. We ruined the Crane family for that cowardice. We starved them out of our lands to protect our own pride. A restless murmur rippled through the lords and ladies. The Duke of Somerset exchanged a confused, worried glance with Lord Minister Thorne, who was hovering near the pillars, sweating profusely. That story, Alaric continued, his voice rising, cutting through the murmurs like a blade, was a lie. Theodora stepped down from the dais, her composure shattering into desperate panic. Alaric, stop this madness. The Duchess has poisoned your mind. Guards, seize that book. None of the royal guards moved. Alaric did not even look at his mother. He held up the ruined journal, turning it so the nobles in the front row could see the heavy, unmistakable crimson wax of the vain royal seal pressed into the final smeared page. This is my father's private journal, Alaric declared. Recovered an hour ago from a sunken vault beneath the riverbank. The final entry, sealed by his own hand, contains his last command. He did not slip. He saw the bargeman's son fall into the mill race. When his guards refused to help, citing the dignity of the crown, my father wrote his final decree. What is a crown that watches its people die from the safety of the shore? Alaric's voice broke just once. the raw grief of a son finally allowed to mourn his father. He went into the water to save a commoner. He was a hero, and his own council, led by the Dowager Queen, buried his bravery because they believed bleeding for a peasant made a king look weak. The hall erupted into a shocked, chaotic uproar. Nobles gasped, some stepped back in horror, while others stared at the Dowager Queen, who was trembling violently, her face the color of ash. "It is a forgery!" Theodora shrieked, pointing a shaking, jeweled finger at Wynne. "She forged it! She is a ferryman's daughter, a peasant from the mud. She is trying to steal the kingdom." Wynne finally let go of Alaric's hand. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the Dowager. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet, deadly calm of her presence drew the eyes of every person in the room. The cold marble seeped through her bare soles, but the fire in her chest was absolute. "I am a ferryman's daughter," Wynne said, the words ringing out clearly, echoing off the iron chandeliers. She looked out at the terrified, silent court. "My name was Winthorn. I grew up on the banks of the Esk. I know the smell of the mud, and I know the pull of the current. You mocked my hands because they know how to hold a pole against the tide. You mocked my posture because I brace myself like someone expecting the floor to give way. And you were right." She turned back to Theodora, her hazel eyes unblinking. "But when the floor did give way today, when a child was drowning in your pristine river, your aristocratic blood did nothing. Your polished etiquette did nothing. The crown stood paralyzed on the bank. It was the ferryman's daughter who went into the water." Wynne reached into her pocket and pulled out the faded, water-stained piece of river glass she had carried for over a decade. She held it up, letting the candlelight catch its dull surface. "Your king decreed that true nobility is not in the blood, but in the action," Wynne said softly, yet the words struck with the force of a hammer. "You buried his truth to protect your vanity, but the river does not care about your vanity. The river always gives back what it takes." Theodora opened her mouth to scream for the guards again, but Alaric stepped forward, his presence suffocatingly dark. "Lord Thorn," Alaric commanded. The Lord Minister flinched, stepping out from the shadows. "You will draft an immediate royal pardon and public apology to the Crane family. Their lands and standing are restored, with full compensation from the royal treasury." Alaric's eyes swept over the room. "And Dowager Queen Theodora is officially stripped of her seat on the Royal Council. She will retire to the northern estate before morning. Anyone who assists her in remaining in this capital will be tried for treason against the true decree of the late king." Theodora collapsed onto the steps of the dais, the fight entirely leaving her rigid body. The iron grip she had held on Maromere for 18 years had been broken by a piece of river glass and a ruined dress. Alaric turned back to Wynne. The anger drained from his face, leaving only a profound, overwhelming reverence. He looked at her muddy gown, her bleeding feet, and the fierce, beautiful exhaustion in her eyes. In front of 200 of the most powerful people in the kingdom, the Crown Prince of Maromere sank to his knees. He took her cold, muddy hand in his, pressing it to his forehead, staining his own skin with the river dirt. "I spent my life believing I had to protect you from the world," Alaric whispered, though the silence of the hall carried his voice to every corner. "I was a fool. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You are the only true monarch this kingdom has left." The Duke of Somerset, an old, proud man who had mocked Wynne's accent only days before, stepped out of the crowd. He looked at the kneeling prince, at the ruined dowager, and finally at the barefoot woman who had saved a child and resurrected a king's honor. Slowly, his joints popping in the quiet room, the Duke lowered himself to one knee, bowing his head. One by one, the silk-clad nobles followed. The rustle of expensive fabric filled the hall as the entire court of Maromere sank to the cold marble floor. They did not bow to her bloodline. They bowed to her truth. The storm broke by morning. The sky over Maromere was a brilliant, washed, clean blue, the swollen river finally receding to its normal banks, leaving behind a thick layer of fertile, dark silt. Linnet Crane was entirely safe, currently asleep in a massive feather bed in the E-ast wing. She was no longer an urchin facing the workhouses. She was the official ward of the crown, the living, breathing proof of the kingdom's redemption. Wynne stood on the riverbank, dressed not in restrictive silk, but in a simple, dark riding habit that allowed her to breathe, to move. Her hair was tied back with a simple ribbon. She watched the green water flow past, the ghost of her brother Toby finally resting quiet in her heart. She had not let go. She had saved the child. Footsteps crunched on the gravel. Alaric walked down to the bank. He was not wearing his velvet coat. He wore simple linen shirt sleeves, his collar open, the heavy silver pocket watch gone from his vest. He stopped beside her, looking out at the water that had haunted his nightmares for 2 decades. "We are commissioning a stone," Alaric said quietly, "to be placed right here on the bank. It will bear my father's name, and directly beneath it, Silas Crane's." Wynne reached out, weaving her fingers through his. "It is a good start, Alaric." He looked down at the water, then at her. He took a deep breath, letting the clean morning air fill his lungs. Without a word, he unlaced his leather boots. He kicked them aside on the grass. Wynne watched, her heart expanding in her chest, as the Crown Prince of Maromere took a slow, deliberate step forward. The cold river water washed over his bare feet, soaking the hems of his trousers. He shivered, but he did not step back. He stood in the river, anchoring himself in the very thing he had feared most, holding the hand of the ferryman's daughter who had taught him how to survive it. The river rushed past them, indifferent and patient, carrying away the last remnants of the kingdom's lies, leaving only the truth standing on the shore.